Community tab yesterday, I posted about getting 5,000 subscribers, but I also asked people what video would they like to see in the future, and a couple people have said it on the post, and some people have said it in the comment sections of other videos, that they would like me to explain Brexit. So obviously most of my audience are American, and I can see in the analytics, you know, pretty much everyone who watches is American. I have a couple British people as well, so I'm sure they will disagree with what I think Brexit is and everything. But for Americans, I just want to tell them what the reality of Brexit is, because you hear it and then people compare it to the election of Donald Trump and everything, and I don't think it's a very accurate representation of what's going on at the moment. And yeah, so this video is just going to tell you what the real reality of it, why we haven't left yet, and why it's taken so long to get a deal and everything. And I'm going to go into a bit of the causes to why it happened in the first place, but that's not really the focus of the video. It's more just talking about how it really came about and how this vote came about. So back in 2015 there was a general election, and it was Ed Miliband versus David Cameron, essentially because in the parliamentary system the Labour Party, led by Ed Miliband at the time, and the Conservative Party, led by David Cameron at the time, are the two biggest parties. So essentially whoever gets the most out of them two win, and their party gets to be in government, and obviously they get to be Prime Minister and everything. But David Cameron promised if he won, we would have a referendum on whether to stay in the EU. So this idea in the 2010s sort of comes from the right wing, but historically socialists and leftists have hated the EU. So in socialists' opinion, the EU isn't sort of like a protection for workers, it's more like a sort of even like trade union for CEOs and corporations, just to really not lose money and exploit people essentially. So instead of, you know, what people may see the EU as, it's like a nice trade bloc, everyone benefits, we get to move around Europe, we get to work wherever we want, pretty much we all use the same money apart from the UK. But in socialist opinion, it's just a big trading bloc to strengthen the oligarchy, strengthen the elite of these countries really. And when we used to have referendums on being in European institutions, it used to be pushed by the left wing that we should leave them or we should stay out of them. But in terms of Brexit in the modern era, yeah, it's pushed by the right wing. And most people in this country don't really think about the EU ever. You know, we barely really talked about it in my lifetime. It only really came up after the 2015 election. And, you know, of course I learnt about the EU in geography. Most kids in the UK go on school trips to places like France and everything. So you have a sort of close tie with Europe, and you know, all our history is pretty linked together. You know, the first king of England in its modern form, William the Conqueror, was actually from Normandy, which became part of France eventually. So we do have a pretty linked history and everything. And some of you might have seen some of the biggest search results on Google the day after the referendum was, what is the EU, or what does it do and everything. Because, you know, people in this country, like many countries, don't know a lot about politics, and they particularly don't know a lot about things like economic trading blocks. But yeah, so we had that election, and then obviously because he'd promised to deliver a referendum, that's what happened the following year. So running up to June 2016, we were having this campaign, and on one side was Remain. So Remain was made up by many politicians from across the political spectrum, including the Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, the Mayor of London Sadiq Khan, the Prime Minister David Cameron from the Tory Party, the Home Secretary Theresa May, who is now the Prime Minister. You had people from the Green Party, you had people from the Lib Dems, including the leader of the Lib Dems, and also in Remain you had most CEOs of corporations, you had most business leaders, you had most people who had an interest in the EU supporting it. So who was on the other side? Who was on the Leave side? So basically you had three figureheads. You had Nigel Farage, who was the leader of UKIP, which is the UK Independence Party. The only reason it exists was to get independence from the EU. Then you had Boris Johnson, who was the former Mayor of London, and then you had Michael Gove, who I think at the time was Education Secretary. And the only others you really had were some Labour MPs, and because like I said, if you were a proper socialist you would generally hate the EU. So that sort of makes sense. But it is funny that the three leading figures of Brexit were three right-wing millionaires. And what's even more funny is that Boris Johnson and Michael Gove were good friends of David Cameron, and he was pretty sure that they wouldn't back Leave, and it was a surprise that they did. And it goes into the heart of what Brexit is. Brexit is actually a Tory leadership contest under the disguise of something else. So Boris Johnson has always wanted to be Prime Minister, as has Michael Gove, and Boris Johnson is a massive opportunist and saw this as his chance to become Prime Minister, and it's really a win-win for him. So if Leave won, he can be seen as this champion of the people, he helps people get independence from the European Union and all this bullshit. But if they lost, he's still a really prominent figure pushing for Leave, and he could keep attacking the government and leading his faction of the Tory party against the government. So for him, there was nothing bad about supporting Leave. It would have boosted his image and boosted his support among the right wing. Now, of course, this country did end up voting to leave, and I'll put a map up on the screen to really highlight the issue. So if you look at the map of England in particular, England cuts off at the north. So it's basically, this map is yellow and blue, and yellow means they voted to remain and blue means they voted to leave. So at the top you have a massive yellow chunk, and that is all Scotland. So basically every single region in Scotland voted to remain in the EU. And as you can see from the map, most regions of England and Wales voted to leave, and in Northern Ireland you have most regions voting to remain in the EU also. But I don't think the English map paints a realistic picture, because if you look at that, you're like, oh wow, England really wanted to leave, everyone in England basically, but most of London wants to remain, and as people know, London is the biggest city in England. It has about 8 million people, and the population of England is only 50 million. So that is a significant chunk of the population, and a lot of cities where a lot of the population are voted to remain as well. And a lot of these other areas you see, especially going towards the south west, is really sparsely populated in terms of the rest of the country, so it makes it look like Leave had a lot more support than it did. Now, people don't remember this at the time, and even people now don't seem to remember it, but the main thing Brexit was fought on was immigration, and it wasn't just about, Polish people coming here and Romanians, even though that played into it, people saying they're taking all our jobs and everything, but it also played on the fears of people being scared of Muslim immigration. And what the main thing was is that Vote Leave would fearmonger about Turkey joining the European Union. Now, Turkey had wanted to join the EU for a long time. I don't think it really does anymore, but at the time, it was trying to, and people were scared 100 million Muslims would be able to freely move to the UK, and that's how racist our population are in general. But yeah, Vote Leave preyed on this. But David Cameron showed everyone at the time that Turkey was so unstable that it would take Turkey another 200 years, essentially, to meet the conditions to get into the EU. So it was total bullshit, but that was a main one, and you heard it on the radio all the time, it was on all the leaflets and everything. And I don't think people realise the extent English people are racist, and I'll happily say that because I don't really consider myself English a lot of the time because I'm half Irish as well. And obviously the history of England and Ireland is awful, and the way the English treated Irish people basically were racist to them in a way, made them feel subhuman. You've probably seen those signs on pubs or houses that says no dogs, no black people and no Irish people, because they were discriminated as well. So it's not surprising to me that English people in general are so racist, especially people who are away from the cities as well, because they're not exposed to diversity or anything like that. So people like to downplay the way racism factored in, but I don't. It is really, really based in racism, because the main issues that we fought it on were immigration, and it wasn't just restricted to immigration from the EU, it was just general immigration and fear-mongering about Muslims, and sometimes it didn't even make sense, because a lot of these things don't really have any bearing on immigration from places like Pakistan or Somalia and stuff, so it really made no sense at all, a lot of the beliefs. And most people in this country are not very well educated to a large extent, and most people wouldn't know what the EU are, even if they were educated. So currently, I'm a freelance writer for this immigration service, which kind of helps people out with visas and everything, and it's really increased my knowledge of how much our economy relies on the EU. So for example, in the construction sector, 10% of our workforce is EU migrants, and they come over here to help out in cities and everything, and because of the free movement, it's very easy for them to come over. And then there's other things like the music industry, where we rely on a lot of foreign labour during festivals, and a lot of foreign acts to come here easily and everything. And the economic argument in general, it is pretty solid for us remaining, because it just makes it so much easier for our economy to be intertwined with others. And as you can see now in the UK, a lot of these companies are leaving, they're putting their headquarters in other places like Ireland or France or Germany. A lot of car manufacturers are now leaving because it's going to be so much harder to get their products out, and there's been a lot of talk about the border. It's going to be way longer to get out of England and into France, which is where we do most of our trade. And also all this stuff like going to the US, trying to get a better trade deal so they can send us chlorinated chicken and all this shit, because if you don't know, the US has way less regulation on food than we do, and part of that trade deal would be allowing them to send it to us, which obviously no one wants, but no one really thought about that before. Are there any legit arguments for leaving the EU? Well, like I said, there are socialist arguments for leaving the EU, but none of these were really put forward because it was the right wing leading the charge on this. I guess you could argue that we rely too much on foreign labour, and we haven't done enough to really help English people with jobs at times. I guess that's an argument. For example, like I was saying, we rely on EU labour for the construction industry, and if more was done to help construction workers, like English ones, and sort of foster these jobs for English people, but a lot of English people are not doing these jobs anymore, and that makes it more ironic because the EU nationals are coming over to fill up these jobs that we're not doing anymore, and that's the point of it. You know, if we were like, let's make more English construction workers, and the government makes an effort to put this into policy, then yeah, that's fair enough, but we're not, and we rely on this labour so much, and it's going to slow down a lot of construction projects. But overall, in my view, the reason we left the EU was because of racism in a massive part, because most people didn't know the first thing about the EU, and most of these places have no experience of diversity, and they just like to blame immigrants for everything. You know, they're older people who voted to leave the EU, they read The Sun and the Mail, which just, you know, propagate hate everywhere all the time. So that, in my view, is why we left. But now I want to talk about the reality of Brexit at the moment. So like I said, I just think Brexit's been a cover for a Tory leadership contest. So straight away after Brexit, David Cameron announced that he was going to resign. So the Conservative Party had its own internal elections to see who would be the new leader. So who put themselves forward? Obviously Boris Johnson, like I was saying, Michael Gove, and then Theresa May. So she'd been playing quite a smart game with Brexit. Even though she voted to remain, she kept pretty quiet, and she didn't really put herself in the spotlight. So when she came out of nowhere to put herself forward for the Tory leadership position, it wasn't like, oh, this Remainer is not going to help us. She did put herself forward at a good time. She was kind of playing politics the whole time. Maybe she had her eye on being Prime Minister throughout this, maybe just like Boris Johnson, but she just wasn't as stupid about it. Now, we had this Tory leadership contest, and what eventually happened is Boris dropped out of the race. And I remember I was working at the Times in London, and it was a big shock to everyone, like, oh, Boris dropped out, he was one of the front runners. But basically, he knew he couldn't win in the end. I think he just didn't have the numbers. And I said to someone at the time, I was sitting at the desk, I said, I bet Theresa May has promised him Foreign Secretary because, you know, he loves Churchill so much, he loves foreign affairs and everything. And of course, I felt so great when Theresa May became Prime Minister and announced her cabinet, she had made Boris Johnson Foreign Secretary. So there, we have our leadership contest, it's all gone away. Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, even though they were pushing to leave the EU to help themselves, they didn't get to become Prime Minister, and Theresa May becomes Prime Minister. But now what happens even more is we're debating over the Brexit deal, and who is leading the charge against Theresa May all the time? It's Boris Johnson, backed by his allies in the Tory party, and this has just been going back and forth for about 3 years now. So Boris Johnson's wing of the Tory party keep attacking Theresa May's deal, saying it doesn't do enough, you know, goes far enough, breaking with the EU and everything like that, because it's all in his bid to be Prime Minister. And I was reading today a tweet that said Boris Johnson is the favourite to be the next Prime Minister because people are thinking Theresa May might resign in the next year. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So before all this stuff has happened recently, we had another election in 2017 because Theresa May thought she could shore up her position. You know, she wanted to get this Brexit deal through. She wanted the Tories to back her because that was the main people going to be voting for it. So she called an election. She was confident she could get more seats at the expense of Labour, and all the polls showed that the Tories would pick up a significant amount of seats and Labour would lose a lot. But what she wasn't relying on was Jeremy Corbyn, who had a great election campaign, and the Tories actually lost so many seats, they lost their majority in Parliament, and Labour gained an increasing amount. So now you have a situation where in the Commons, the Tories can't even get through their Brexit deal, even if all the members of their party sit in the Commons vote for it, because they just don't have enough. And to show you how corrupt everything is, this then led Theresa May to pay a £1 billion bung to the DUP. Now, the DUP are the Northern Irish Protestant Party. They're basically the Ulster Unionists, and they have their roots, you know, from a long time being associated with the English, the Protestants in Northern Ireland. I think they have 10 MPs in the Commons. So that 10 would be a good number for Theresa May to get her Brexit deal passed, because that would make them the largest voting bloc. So if you had the Tories and the DUP combined all voting on her deal, they could get it passed even if Labour, Greens, SNP, Lib Dems all voted against it, and that's what she needed. But ever since then, the DUP have been really pushing her hard on Brexit as well, so they barely vote for her deals anyway, and the DUP have their own interests. So now you have a situation where Theresa May puts forward a deal, the DUP don't vote for it, right-wing Tories don't vote for it, most centre Tories don't vote for it, so you have only a small majority of Tories vote for it and everyone else votes against it. So at the moment, everyone just hates Theresa May's deal because it doesn't go far enough for the right wing, it doesn't do enough for the DUP, the left wing and the centrists all hate it anyway because it doesn't keep ties of Europe close enough. And still what we're seeing is the right wing, the far right in the Tory party, they're just seeking to take over the government, and that's what this whole thing is about. Because if you honestly think a lot of these people even care about Brexit, you are deluding yourself. Like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's a big figurehead for the Tories and the Tory Brexiteers, who's absolutely loaded. He does not give a shit about this stuff. It's all about becoming important. It's all about getting into the government for people like him and Boris Johnson. Because I asked him the other day, will you disclose how much you make and how much you earn and everything, and he wouldn't. And that's the problem. If you honestly think right-wing millionaires like Jacob Rees-Mogg, like Boris Johnson, like Michael Gove, even people like Theresa May, want to do anything to help you, you are seriously deluding yourselves. Because what you might not also know, in the UK, the Tory party is a symptom of this establishment we have. So Eton and Oxbridge churn out Tory politicians and Tory prime ministers one after another. Like, most of our prime ministers have gone to Eton and Oxford or Cambridge, and they all come from the same system, and they can trace back their family history to like 1300, and they're related to like old medieval kings and shit like that. And that's how far the rich's roots go in this country, and you don't have that in places like America. It's a lot of new money a lot of the time. Like, so people like Donald Trump, for example, his family are German immigrants and shit. So like, it's not like rooted in old America or anything like the Tory party are. And if Jeremy Corbyn, who traditionally doesn't like the EU, if he was leading the Leave campaign, if he was leading all this stuff, you could trust him a bit more, because at least from his ideological perspective and his background, you can see he's a champion for working class people. He wants what's best for this country, essentially, and wants what's best for the people. Where you can't trust people who are so loaded, whether or not we leave the EU matters to them, because it doesn't matter to them, because it won't affect their income, and the only thing they care about is getting into the government and becoming the Prime Minister in people like Jacob Rees-Mogg or Boris Johnson's case, and that is all they fucking care about. So let's summarise all of this. The only reason a Brexit referendum was called was because David Cameron promised it in the 2015 election, and he was only doing that to appease some right-wingers in his party, because most of the people in the country were not clamouring for this sort of stuff, because they just weren't, because most people didn't know enough about it, or most people weren't affected enough by the EU sort of stuff. And then we had the referendum, where the Leaves campaign was led by 3 right-wing millionaires, funded by right-wing millionaires, and primarily based on immigration and using racist stereotypes about Muslims and others like Polish people and Romanians to scare everyone into voting to leave. And as I said, the next day on Google, one of the biggest searches in the UK was what is the EU and shit like that, because no one knew what the hell it was. And then in the next couple of years, all we've just been seeing playing out, it's not Theresa May trying to get a good deal for anyone, it's her trying to cling onto power while Boris Johnson and the other right-wingers try and take it from her. And that is literally it. But because our population are so fucking stupid, they won't vote out the Tories even after the disaster we've been witnessing over the last 3 years. So yeah, there you have it. That is what Brexit is. To anyone who's been listening, it's not the will of the people and all this shit. We only had 72% of people vote, and they only won by 2%. So it's not the will of the people. Most people didn't know what they were voting for. And the people who were leading that campaign obviously had other interests than helping working class people. They played on this image of England that doesn't exist anymore, trying to make us, make England great again. That's the similarities it has with Donald Trump. People voting for some change and people voting for racism, essentially. And this is this is the mess we have. So what should happen now is, because Theresa May's deal didn't go through another time, we're going to delay Brexit. What should happen is there should be another general election on Brexit, and everyone should decide whose ideas on Brexit do I like better. Do I want Jeremy Corbyn to lead the Brexit negotiations? Do I trust him to get the better deal? Or, like an idiot, do I trust Theresa May, even though she's failed so many times, to get me a good deal? And do I trust the Tories again? And like in America, this is something people need to understand. People will vote against their own interest no matter what. The same way the Republicans completely screw over a large chunk of people who vote for them, the same thing happens in England. A lot of people who vote for the Conservative Party are working class, are poor people, but because they're whipped up into a frenzy by the Sun and the Daily Mail, they're filled with racism and xenophobia, and because the Tories and UKIP and parties like that appeal to that, they keep voting for that and then wonder why, it's harder to get good healthcare in this country, while the Tories privatise the NHS or cut their benefits and cut things that benefit them. But I guess it's okay, and it's worthwhile sacrifice to Tory poor voters because they get a nice racist party in power. So yeah, I hope I explained what I think the reality of Brexit is well. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you're British, I'm sure you're not going to agree with me. You're going to attack me saying, oh, it's the will of the people and all this shit, but I don't really care. This is the reality of Brexit, and you know it deep down. It hasn't been done for anyone's benefit apart from wealthy millionaires and right-wing politicians. If you have any suggestions for other videos, put it down in the comments. Thanks everyone for finally getting me to 5,000 subscribers. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate all the new comments from people I've been getting, and that Bernie Sanders video that blew up, kind of, You know, I've got so many comments. It's hard to reply to everyone, but you know, I do appreciate all the comments people leave. You can find me on social media at The Tabernacle on both Instagram and Twitter. I'd say follow me on Instagram if you want to keep up to date with my videos, because I always post it as a new Instagram post and I put it on my story, so you'll never miss anything. I also write some stuff on my WordPress blog, and that's just The Tabernacle WordPress. So make sure to leave a like and maybe share this video with some other people who aren't from England or Britain, who don't know what's going on with Brexit, and maybe they can look at this video and realise what it is. And if you've made it this far, thank you for watching.